The Nara period of Japanese history lasted from 710 to 784. The period began in 710 with the establishment of the capital at Heijō-kyo, today known as Nara. The Nara period came to an end in 784 when the capital was transferred to the city that is today Kyoto. In the Nara period, China served as a model for developments in Japanese government and religion. A centralized bureaucracy was created, and Buddhism was promoted as a political institution. In 743, the Emperor Shomu had a huge Birushana Buddha constructed in the capital. The symbolism was significant, since the Birushana Buddha is the ruler of all Buddha worlds. As a symbol, the Birushana Buddha reinforced the legitimacy of centralized government in Japan. The Birushana Buddha sculpture and the temple in which it is located, Todaiji, became the center of religious power, serving as the authority over all provincial temples. The close connection between the hierarchies existing in church and state evolved from direct imitation of the structure that had proved so effective for wielding power in China. The Great Buddha, the Birushana Buddha at Todaiji today, is a reconstruction made in 1692, but it gives a sense of the original. To create the Buddha in 743, all the copper in Japan was gathered, and as a result, virtually no more bronze casting was done for centuries. Over 370,000 workers were employed in the project. The project began on the grounds of Shomu's palace, but following a number of failures, the casting was done at Nara beginning in 745. It would ultimately take 4 years. When completed, the Great Buddha was surrounded by the largest wooden structure in the world, the Daibutsuden. 50,000 carpenters were employed in building it. It measured more than 230 feet across. The version that exists today is smaller in size and has been squared off. The hall and the Buddha it contains are still impressive. It gives a good indication of the importance that Buddhism had acquired in Japan by the early 8th century. Immediately following the establishment of the capital at Nara, a number of temples were constructed in the city. The largest of these, Kofukuji, was built by the Fujiwara clan. The original Kofukuji was destroyed by civil war and fires, so none of the original buildings remain. Many of the structures were rebuilt over the centuries. Some of the original sculptures have survived. Among them, this image of Kasenin, one of the 10 disciples of the Buddha. This work, and the others with which it originally formed a group, was made using a new technique called Dakkatsu Kanshitsu, or hollow dry lacquer. Lacquer is hard and waterproof, so it makes a more durable medium than wood. Lacquer is the resin of a certain kind of sumac, Joboji urashi, as it's known in Japan. It's been used extensively in Japanese art since the Jomon period. Lacquer trees were commercially grown beginning in the Nara period, usually on mountainous terrain that was less suitable for farming other crops. The industry became important enough that government controls were imposed through an office for lacquer. In the mid-7th century, a tax was levied for the first time on the lands where lacquer trees were grown. The dry lacquer technique of making sculpture began with a roughly modeled figure in clay over a wooden armature. Over the surface of the clay, as many as 10 layers of lacquer-soaked cloth were applied, with each being allowed to dry before the next was added. After the final layer was dry, the back was cut open and the clay was removed and replaced by wooden framework supports. Arms and feet were usually carved out of wood and added, and small details such as eyes and noses were fashioned out of a mixture of lacquer, powdered clay, incense, and sawdust. The completed sculpture was finished with either a black lacquer or a gesso-like mixture of clay and glue, over which gold leaf was often applied. Toward the end of the 8th century, a less complicated version of the dry lacquer technique was invented, in which the mixture of lacquer, incense, powdered clay, and sawdust was applied directly to a wooden core that had been hollowed out. Part of the Todaiji Temple complex is a building known as the Hokkeido, or Hall of the Lotus Sutra. The building was remodeled in the Kamakura period, when a worship hall was added in front of the sanctuary. Made around 733, one of the original Nara period sculptures in the Hokkeido is this image of Shukongojin, a defensive figure. With a fierce expression on his face and a thunderbolt in his hand, he stands within a lacquer cabinet behind the main altar. As a hidden treasure, the figure is only taken out of the cabinet once a year. Made of ceramic and covered with gold leaf and paint, the figure is depicted wearing a robe and armor of Chinese type. In the main altar of the Hokkeido is a group of diverse sculptures, at the center of which is a 12-foot tall Fuku Kenjaku Kannon. This 8-armed figure represents one of the 33 forms of Kannon. It was made around 740 using the hollowed dry lacquer technique. The additional eye in the forehead emphasizes the Kannon's power. The 8 arms represent the ability to rescue deluded beings and carry them to enlightenment. 2 of the hands are held together in front of the chest, while the others grasp symbols that include a lotus blossom, which represents Buddhist wisdom, a pilgrim's staff, and a lasso, which suggests the ability to rescue those who are deluded. The metal halo behind the figure consists of radiating lines, flame motifs, and oval bands that echo the contours of the body and suggest emanating light. The crown is made of silver and bears a relief image of a standing Buddha. Since the materials and workmanship of this figure are exceptional, it's thought to have been made in a government workshop under the supervision of the artist Kuninaka Kimimaro. Kimimaro, the son of a Korean immigrant, is also thought to have been involved in making the images for the Great Buddha Hall at Todaiji. On each side of the Fuku Kenjaku Kannon are 2 figures who are traditionally identified as Nikko and Gakko. They were probably originally made to represent the Indian gods Brahma and Indra, who became king figures in Japanese Buddhism. The figures are made from clay over wooden armatures. This painting dates from the late Nara period and is done in bright pigment and gold on a textile made of hemp. It depicts Kichijoten, the goddess of wealth and good fortune, who was a popular deity in the late 8th century. She was also prayed to for rain and healthy crops. As a goddess, Kichijoten is a model of feminine beauty, as it was conceived at the time. Her face is round and fleshy, her eyes are wide and narrow, her mouth is small, and her body is implicitly heavy, although she's made to look almost weightless by the floating drapery of her garments. An important innovation in Japanese painting in the late Nara period was the horizontal scroll, or emaki. Also known as emakimono, it would become a major Japanese painting format. Scrolls are attached at the left end to a jiku, or wooden dowel around which the paper could be rolled. On the reverse of the paper is a heavier piece of paper or silk, the hyoshi, that acts as a cover when the scroll is rolled up. A cord attached at the haso, or end of the scroll, can be tied around it when it's rolled up to keep it closed. Ordinarily, emaki were kept rolled up until they were read. Japanese is read from right to left. Since some emaki are quite long, the right-hand side is rolled up around the haso as the left-hand side is unrolled. When the emaki is stored, it's re-rolled so that the right-hand side, with the cord attached, will be outermost, and the jiku will be at the center of the roll. A group of 8 Nara period emaki depicts scenes from the Sutra of Cause and Effect. In this group, the scenes illustrate stories from the life of the Shakyamuni Buddha from the time of his childhood in the palace to his enlightenment and preaching. The scrolls were painted by different artists and originally belonged to several different groups. In this example, the illustrations are above the text, but in later periods the convention was to paint images next to the text. The scene depicted here, which was probably based on Chinese precedents, is the temptation of Shakyamuni, in the center, by Mara, the king of evil, who's on the right. After 6 years of meditation in the desert, Shakyamuni is close to enlightenment, and Mara fears the power that he will acquire. Mara sends demons, above, left, and right, but these fail to shake Shakyamuni's resolve. Then Mara tries to tempt him by sending his 2 beautiful daughters, on the left. Unaffected, Shakyamuni asks the earth to witness his spiritual strength, and a spring immediately opens in front of him and water flows forth. This is one of the most commonly represented scenes from the life of the historical Buddha. During the Nara period, the principal ceramic forms remained sueki and hajiki. A new type of pottery known as sanage was introduced during the Nara period. The sanage kilns were built in what is now Aichi Prefecture, near modern Nagoya, in the early 7th century. By the late 8th century, the sanage kilns were producing the first stoneware in Japan that was deliberately glazed, making it more advanced than sue wares or sueki. Very few examples have survived, and most are from the 11th century. This piece was made in the first half of the 9th century. About 10 inches tall, it has a slightly splayed foot, which is typical of stoneware pieces from this period. The piece was made partly using the wheel, but it also has traces from where it was shaped by a hera, or bamboo tool. Sanage had a gray to white stoneware body with a greenish glaze made by mixing wood ash with water and a bit of clay. When the pots were partly dry, they were rolled or dipped in the glaze, which tended to create just a thin coating. During firing, the silica in the wood ash vitrified, creating a glassy layer. During the Nara period, another intentionally glazed pottery, known as Nara Sansai, or Nara 3-colorware, was also produced. It was made on the wheel from a highly refined, generally iron-free clay. The pieces were bisque-fired, then the surfaces were daubed in iron and copper-lead glazes over a white slip. The copper glaze produced green, and the iron glaze produced brown, which appeared yellow when it was thinly applied over the white slip. All the glazes were covered with transparent glaze before firing a second time. Nara Sansai was a direct imitation of a Tang Dynasty polychrome type from China, Tang Sansai, which is thought to have been first produced around 690. It's not known whether the first Nara Sansai was made by immigrant Chinese potters or native Japanese, but the technique for producing it arrived in Japan relatively soon after it was developed in China. It remained popular until the Heian period, when it was displaced by green-glazed and ash-glazed wares.